Yo, fellas, look at that! It looks like we're back, and it didn't take as much time as it did last time, and that is, of course, because, well, I'm here, not really employed, and I'm gonna keep making videos until, well, I don't have the time to make them anymore, but it's not gonna be like that anymore. But anyway, this year I kind of felt that I missed out on Halloweeny season, with the whole moving out thing, but today we got a very special treat when it comes to the world of survival horror, and that is, of course, Signalis, or Signalis, but the Italian's gonna come through really hard this video, so from here on out, it's just gonna be Signalis, developed by Rose Engine. Signalis is an isometric survival horror game from German developer Rose Engine, a developer with an astounding 2 people doing most of the work on the game, which, regarding the results we ended up with, is simply incredible. In Signalis, you play as an android machine thing known in this world as a replica, and goes by the name of Elster, which is a nickname for LSTR, or Light Ship Technician something something, since I kinda forgot what it means and I can't readily find it online. Your deep space exploration vessel in the Penrose program has crash-landed on the shadowy moon of Ling, where the mining colony has digged deeper and deeper than anyone should have and unearthed something absolutely horrible. So with as much courage as she can muster, Elster enters the Sierpinski facility with nothing else other than a picture of a girl and a promise to keep. But for now, we're going to let the story simmer for a little while, and instead we're going to take a look at Signalis' gameplay. While the visual design definitely harkens back to survival horror classics of old, it can also be seen in the gameplay, which apart from tank controls, plays just like Resident Evil or Silent Hill would have on the PS1. And while the movement isn't specifically tank controls, though you can turn it on if you so wish, with the isometric view, it definitely gives it a similar feel when paired with all the familiar pacing of exploring the facility, solving puzzles and mysteries, and killing enemies. Now at first it doesn't seem so bad. Sure, it's a little off and maybe there's some violence going around, but fellas, once we get down and deeper into the Sierpinski facility, it's gonna show that something went horribly wrong. Elster isn't the only replica in Sierpinski, and the vast remnants of all the other ones have been horrifically transformed by whatever they have unearthed in the mines, with the skin of once merry Yules having been ripped off and donning cleavers to search the halls for anyone left. Though since there are different types of replica in the facility, ranging from lowly Yules to more potent Mina-type replicas with mining lasers, the bulk of your enemies are going to reflect what they were before the change into a perversion of their former selves. But even though they might have been pretty damn cute beforehand, these fiends are trying to rip your skin off. So it's best to destroy them with a variety of weapons found throughout the game, ranging from your trusty pistol to the shotgun and of course stronger weapons, like the Magnum or a hunting rifle. In an interesting twist, the enemies that you dispatch will stay down for a little while unless you light them up on fire with a thermite flare, which reminds me of using matches to kill enemies for good in the original The Evil Within. It also makes way for greater tension as you can never really get rid of all the enemies on the map, since there are never enough flares for you to use, which gives the player a series of dilemmas that I personally believe makes horror games more spooky. Alrighty fellas, you're gonna have to forgive me here for a little bit because we're gonna have to go on a little teeny tiny tangent. So I think I might have said this all the way back in my The Evil Within 2 review, but when it comes to horror games, while I can admire the craftsmanship of some so-called quote-unquote walking simulators, like the first Amnesia, Soma, or even last year's The Medium, as a general rule of thumb, I don't really find them that scary to me. Surely they can be spooky and the subject material can be horrifying, especially with Soma, but it doesn't really get the blood pumping like a normal survival horror game does for me, like the OG Silent Hill, Resi, or in today's case, Signalis. See, with walking sims, when you always know that going into a closet or hiding under a bed works, then it's a one-trick pony. After that, you know exactly what the remedy is and you'll enact it time and time again. Meanwhile, with survival horror where there's combat, it gives you a dilemma. Are you going to try and run past these enemies, potentially getting damage from them, or are you going to use your precious resources to deter and kill them? In these moments, the game grips you and you're forced to make a choice, and you don't know whether or not it's going to be the right one. And that friggin' scares me more than any amount of hiding in the closet and waiting for the monster to go away. Of course, spooks are subjective, and if you like those kinds of games that I might have thrown shade on, then don't worry about my opinion, because for quite a few of them, I might actually really enjoy them. So with that out of the way, when you're not really worried about putting a bunch of double-aught buck into a replica's face, you're going to be more worried about solving the myriad of different puzzles that you can find in the Sierpinski facility. While exploring the Sierpinski facility, you're going to come across a bunch of different puzzles that come in all different types of styles, ranging from simple finding a note with a combination for a safe, or figuring out the right mixture of gases to safely turn off the incinerator. A number of the puzzles that I really enjoy, and it is a motif throughout the whole game, is that there's a series of puzzles and mechanics that revolve around the use of the radio and various different radio signals. Some are as simple as figuring out the numbers that a certain signal is broadcasting, to as complex as one of the puzzles that I won't spoil that you can get for one of the different endings that is so ridiculously complex that it's not even funny, but it's so friggin' cool. But overall, I really enjoyed Signalis' frequent use of puzzles. While not all of them are the most complex that range into adventure game moon logic, but it is nice to actually pull out a notepad every so often and jot some things down and figure it out that way. And the use of the radio itself is a great motif, not just for some narrative reasons that I'll talk about soon, but to me I find it really great homage to Silent Hill. There's even a circumstance where you'll fight a replica that uses signals to try and phase you that remind me of the radio going nuts in Silent Hill. Now, it might seem that the gameplay is absolutely flawless, and to me it kinda is, but this is kind of a style thing, and some people might not like certain choices in the game, so let's talk about what some might consider its flaws. There's only a few flaws that could be found with Signalis, and I tend to think of these as more stylistic choices, especially when paired with the narrative reasons behind them, but as usual, things can always be improved. For example, there's only 6 slots of inventory that Elster has on her, and thusly you can only hold 6 items, which, when you take into account different weapons, a flashlight, ammo, and health, it basically fills up your inventory. So if you're the type of person that likes to hoard ammo and weapons, then you might find this approach annoying, since it only leaves you with so much to work with for puzzle items. Personally, I see it as another dilemma that the game throws at you. Are you going to have the weapons and ammo to blast through the facility in short order? Or are you going to keep space for some puzzle items so you can solve them along the way, sacrificing some combat potential? Regardless, by the nature of the levels and the style of the gameplay you choose, there's going to be a decent amount of backtracking to figure out puzzles or to restock on items and grab different puzzle items, which gives us some problems since the replicas, after a certain period of time, will actually get back up and try to dispatch you once more, adding another layer to the dilemma of what to do, which you can probably tell I'm loving every moment of. But what sells it for me is that it is explained early in the game that everyone in the nation of USA needs to remember the rule of 6, which means to only have 6 items on hand because personal property is evil. Which is now that we're going to start talking about the setting and how it's really neat, because instead of just a normal regular survival horror that you gotta go through the Sierpinski facility and figuring out all of that nonsense, we're actually looking through it through the eyes of a regular Joe and a dystopic communist hellhole. An element that I love of Signalis' narrative that I'll get to soon is that the whole thing is layered like the sweetest cake. It's not just, ooh, you're running into a spooky facility, or ooh, maybe there's an eldritch god at work here. But it's also layered with things that we don't see often, such as, ooh, the horrors on top of the already dismal lives of living in a totalitarian society, ooh. And you see this everywhere in the game with how it goes about doing the puzzles, because in each one of them we get to see how these people, and usually replica, live in this world. When you have to fix a certain object for a puzzle, there'll be a lot of flavor text like "this part cannot be sourced because everything is used for the war effort." Or a puzzle has to do with a certain kind of replica, so through completing the task, you get to learn more about that specific type, and then feel despaired by how through whatever horror is racking the facility has distorted that model. For example, without spoiling anything, one of the replica models you'll come across in combat is called a colibri, or German for hummingbird, which is a type of replica that in the eyes of the Nation is there to telepathically calm the nerves of the gestalts, aka humans, of the facility. But really, this is code word for colibri units telepathically spying on the people of the nation, looking for anyone that might be a traitor, or sows dissent in any kind of way. Which is tragic because from reading materials in the universe from the units that they're very calm and caring, which sadly, when twisted by the horrors of the facility, turns into, well, this. I guess at this point, it's probably fine time to jump headfirst into Signalis' story, but kind of forgive me here because there's a whole lot of stuff to unpack in the story, and I'm going to try and do my best in unpacking it without spoiling none of it. As you could glean from the previous section, the vast amount of Signalis' story is provided to you by environmental storytelling. Whether it be from reading notes of various different replica units, reading reports from the Nation about how their society functions, or the fleeting moments when someone will actually be able to talk to you. And with every interaction, every note read builds up on the world that even before all the events of the game takes place in what would be a dreary and miserable life to live. But it's not even the main story of the game. This is all really just window dressing for the setting, but it's done in such a great and fascinating way that it builds up on the struggle that Elster has to go through to keep her promise. So while this help builds up the individual story and the story of others affected throughout the course of the game, I can't help but almost want more material with what's going on in the wider setting. The game is so detailed in individual pieces of the puzzle that you put together that when you realize that you don't have all the pieces, it makes you crave for more. You want to know more about the interstellar war going on with the Empire, what some other planets that are mentioned are like, and how everything sort of came to be, many of which we only really see through glimpses. But all that we've been talking about so far has really been the window dressing. And if all this interesting lore is the antipasti to the main course that we're about to receive, then holy hell, fellas, you gotta strap yourself in because we're gonna head into some psycho territory. When I mean that Signalis is some psycho shish, I mean to say that this game is some real friggin' psycho shish. And I honestly don't know how to crunch down all the thematic elements of Signalis into one spot because the game is never really in one spot. Every time you learn something new, it only really provides more questions, and the more questions you solve, and the more confident you become, a missed detail from ages past or the beginning of this odyssey will come back and then unravel your brain all over again. It makes you feel as if you're truly going insane, which is fitting because while outright sanity is not a major thematic element, the corruption of things definitely seems to be. Throughout the journey, you will be witnessing the breakdown of things around you, whether it be the surreal reality you find yourself in that doesn't quite make sense, or the perversion of simple replica units to the abomination of the flesh. Something happened to the normal flesh of the gestalts of the facility, but the sickness that ravages it infects the replica differently, because they aren't fully human, and the parts that get transformed, they get fused into the machine. The once pure flesh falls off, leaving only the mechanical grimace for all to see, and with it goes the mind, twisted where the replica performs a distorted version of the tasks that they were built for. There's certainly more to talk about the themes of corruption in Signalis, but to kind of go any further, we're going to be spoiling some stuff, so I'm just going to leave it at that for you people to enjoy. So with corruption also comes the breakdown of other aspects. Sometimes it feels like reality itself is not just becoming undone per se, but there's something just not right with it. Signalis has this dreamlike feel to everything that makes it feel like events, characters, and Elster are all kind of distant to each other. It's not like a time where a playset is different, but it feels that the world is one big waking dream, and with it certain nightmares are spawned. Yet regardless of what is thrown her way, Elster continues to persevere in the face of overwhelming adversity. And for whichever way you choose to look at it, there's certain aspects of Elster's character that could be the culprit. Some more interesting than others. But the one we know from the get-go is that a promise needs to be kept. What exactly the promise is, you won't find out till well into the game. Needless to say, once you play it, you'll see throughout the game various examples of promises made, concords kept, and pacts sealed. But while I can't explain it fully as to not spoil anything, I will say that everything all comes beautifully together at the end. And when you get to the end, you'll have experienced a long journey wrought with horror, violence, perversion, and ultimately a timeless tragedy that when you get to the credits, it will have you back in your seat thinking of all that transpired. Signalis has definitely been one of the more thought-provoking games that I've played in a long time. And a lot of it has to do with the narrative and a set of really cool and unique influences. So, let's talk about some influences. Signalis is another one of those games where it really isn't shy to show where its influences come from, and that's not a bad thing at all in my opinion, since to me it's some very transformative work that creates its own unique thing in the end. These influences range from gameplay influences to aesthetic influences and even influences from cinema and anime to create a really unique product in the end. Take for instance the PS1 survival horror aesthetic that looks like it could be placed right alongside the greats of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but then Signalis takes some influences in the style from Japanese manga and animation, such as the works of Tsutomu Nihei, who's known for the manga Blame and Knights of Sidonia. Though I will admit that I'm not really super familiar with his work, so if there's any thematic influences that are present in Signalis that go right over my head, then I apologize. Then of course, we got gameplay influences that very clearly harken back to the classics of Resi and Silent Hill, which can be seen in the managing of your inventory to kill some poor decrepit replica, or solving puzzles that feel like they could have been right out of Resident Evil. Though my favorite has to be the cute little stomp that Elster does to keep some replica down, which is right out of Silent Hill. Now, some of my favorite influences are going to be the ones that you find in literature and cinema, with influences such as H.P. Lovecraft and maybe, I can't really pin down if it is or not, but maybe the work of David Lynch. So while I can't pinpoint the specific influences to the films of David Lynch, I will say that the whole game has a very Lynchian dreamlike feel to the whole thing. Like the ideas of wandering in and out of realities that may or may not be a dream, or just feeling like you're in one. Specifically, if you have ever seen Lost Highway, which is one of my favorite Lynch films, it feels a lot like the beginning act of that film where the house seems to flow in and out of time, and even reality with the stark shadows creating these walls between places. Playing Signalis feels like a 12-hour version of that first act of Lost Highway. You go through the Sierpinski facility and you know what's going on, but your mind is kind of lost to all of it. Details and aspects of it feel like a dream, like you're not really there even though the horror that's happening to Elster, it's all too real. This is also a short plug to go watch some of the cinema of David Lynch, especially Lost Highway that I absolutely adore. But anyway, let's keep going. As for the literary influences in Signalis, it is very obviously take some notes from H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, and the really obvious one being in Robert William Chambers. Without spoiling both the works and how it relates to Signalis, I can say that from Lovecraft, it takes a lot of themes from his work, but as stated in the credits, the direct influence is in The Festival, where the protagonist of the said short story comes back home to witness a messed up otherworldly festival that his town has to deal with. Ambrose Pierce's work, on the other hand, comes from one of his most famous stories known as An Inhabitant of Carcosa, that while I won't really describe because it actually hints at big revelations in Signalis, but I will say that it inspired the works of both Lovecraft and Chambers. Chambers' work being The King in Yellow, which is a series of short stories about a fictional play of the same name that if you read it, you go insane and potentially fall under the thrall of an unknown being. Now, if you are all too familiar with any of these works, or even the word Eldritch, I'm going to come in and say that while Signalis takes a lot of influences from the above works, that isn't to say that the way you think it's going to happen is the way you expect. This isn't another dime a dozen story of unearthing an ancient evil that ruins everything and kills everyone. The influences put into Signalis from these works is a lot more nuanced, and honestly it's kind of unique. So if you think you have an idea how things are going to go down, then I would recommend to not be so hasty, because it probably isn't what you think it's going to be. But needless to say that I would be the best just to jump right into the game. Now, with that out of the way, let's wrap up the narrative section. So we come to the end of this section, and I'm sitting here at the keyboard feeling like I just wrote a bunch of crap down that somehow still doesn't really summarize what Signalis is about. And honestly, that's probably the best way I can wrap it up, and maybe it's for the best. What I can say is that you're going to get a game that, while not the longest, can be an experience that you lose yourself into. And when you get to the other side, it might leave you a little teary-eyed. Signalis is not a very happy story. There's not a lot of respite in the sad world of Alistair navigating the facility with nothing but her wits and a picture of a girl, dealing with both the horrors of what a society like the Usen Nation can produce, and sort of a dreamlike limbo that you find yourself in. And to be perfectly honest, Signalis isn't a game that will reveal their full hand by the end. The conclusion might just leave you with as many questions as it does answers. But if you're anything like me, you're gonna be so wholly satisfied with this game. So with that out of the way, let's finally shuffle over to Signalis' amazing, magnificent presentation. Without trying to repeat myself too much, you can tell that the game has that classic PS1 low poly revival aesthetic that so many games try to replicate these days, of which I will certainly never complain because I friggin' love that era of gaming. But it's not always presented in this way. Many times throughout the game you will be met with beautifully done 2D cutscenes, where you can really get a feel for what everyone looks like, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Well, in a very morbid fashion. You get to see the interesting design style of all the different replica, where that Nihei influences really kick in. Usually splashed with cuts to frame, so it'll be entirely German or in Chinese. In these cutscenes, you'll see a lot of techniques and references to the production of film with clear cuts to frames that look like you're splicing together footage, especially with the occasional frame left intentionally blank sort of shots. Even the environment has some different styles and blemishes that really sets it apart from the rest of the riffraff that you find out there. Shifting aside for a second, the environmental design also can showcase how cold and dehumanizing the setting can be, since it's an interesting melding of retrofuturistic utilitarian architecture with very East German-inspired communist revolutionary propaganda posters, talking about the war or the various different replicas or rules within the society. Especially in Sierpinski facility, where we eventually figure out what the facility is actually used for, you get to kinda see how the world forces its inhabitants to get rid of all the personal touches, all in service for the Usen Nation. There's also this reoccurring juxtaposition between all the hyper-advanced tech, like the replica spacecraft and mining lasers, with cassette tapes, floppy disks, and other varieties of long-dead obsolete technology. But the coolest part is that this seemingly nonsensical juxtaposition eventually gets explained in a really neat way, with notes that just go over to show how interesting the world is and how the narrative and environmental storytelling are well wound. together. Now, one of the coolest stylistic choices in the presentation that Signalis has that I just absolutely love is its use of real-world paintings and classical music as influences that are actually in the game and make up a good part of its narrative. Without getting into too much detail over the extensive amount of classical music in paintings, since a lot of it is kind of, like metaphors for the plot, I will say that their inclusion takes an already fantastic style and takes it just another step beyond. One of the aforementioned paintings is Tomthechosen1, also known as Island of the Dead, painted by Swiss painter Arnold Böcklin, which depicts a desolate and rocky islet seen across an expanse of dark water, with a boat and an oarsman arriving to the island. Another wonderful example is the painting Gestade Vergessenheit, sorry for the Germans out there, or known as Shores of Oblivion by German painter Eugene Brach, which showcases a dark shore seemingly at the end of time, in an era where humanity no longer exists, the shore littered with the skulls of long-lost humanity. Other references that I can pick out are references to fractal patterns and optical illusions. For instance, I'm almost certain that the Sierpinski facility is named in reference to the Sierpinski triangle, which is an endless fractal pattern of triangles. There's also, of course, the Penrose program, which is the name of the program undertaken by the ship that you crash-landed on, which most likely is an allusion to the optical illusion known as the Penrose triangle. And on top of that, there's probably way more references and allusions to other things that I'm probably not aware of, which if I knew radio terminology, I could probably pick out because there's a lot of cool stuff going on with the radio in the background. Now fellas, if you know me, then you know it's about time that we start talking about the amazing soundtrack to Signalis. And of course, we're going to talk about the sections that are done by the two composers, which are 1000 Eyes and Cicada Sirens. And there's also a small section that we're going to talk about the public domain classical music that is used throughout the game that really gives it a nice cinematic feel. In a nutshell, I think you can generally split the soundtrack into 3 different feels, those being the combat tracks that would fit right in with the nail-biting, tooth-drilling droning of Silent Hill, more softer and ominous tracks that set the tone for the game, and of course, its use of classical music. First, we're going to talk about the combat tracks. While not exclusively of 1000 Eyes' domains, it certainly seems that they did a good chunk of the work for the tracks that fit right in with a migraine. The combat tracks have this droning industrial feel with discordant clanking, grinding, and whining that makes a mind-pulsing onslaught against you every time you are in an unfortunate position to have to dispatch some replica. And while it's not the type of music I would listen to in my car, well, except for that time that I used to actually play the Silent Hill OSTs in my car, the combat tracks fit right in with that brand of survival horror. But at times, 1000 Eyes tones it down for some more ambient and atmospheric tracks that still have a lot of industrial sound to it but are more relaxing. But instead, they convey a very solemn and atmosphere of times long past. Then on the other hand, we get Cicada Sirens, who seems to be the one that has done a good chunk of the atmospheric tracks, like what I would consider the game's main theme in Double Back, which is a very solemn track that drives his loneliness and encapsulates Elster's journey perfectly. It feels like there's this nagging impulse at the back of your mind propelling you forward, and that is of course the promise that needs to be kept, so you go into the facility in order to finish what you've started. A lot of Cicada Siren's other work in the soundtrack seems to pop up throughout the different cutscenes or instances that really drive the plot forward. But of course, that isn't to say that there aren't a few combat tracks done by him. And lastly, of course, there's the inclusion of classical music in various points in the game that create a more cinematic feel that almost seems like the universe is trying to tell a story than the developers, if that kind of makes any sense. A lot of the other times, the classical tracks will be used for instances of diegetic sound, the most famous of which that can be seen everywhere, such as in Resident Evil, is of course Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven. Other great tracks that show up throughout are the Presto to Vivaldi's L'estate, also known as Summer, or one of my favorite classical tracks, and Frédéric Chopin's Raindrop Prelude that makes an absolutely phenomenal intro to the whole experience. But of course, why delay it any further? If you know my videos well enough, then you know that it's time to expect a montage, so let's let the game speak for itself. Fellas, we're here at the rating, and the thing is that I'm kind of a little bit conflicted. I would really love to give this game a masterpiece rating, but I kind of literally just did that in the last video, so instead I'm going to give it a 100% legendary 10 out of 10. Now, I'm not saying that Signalis is perfect, because it has a few aspects that some people might not enjoy when it comes to the gameplay, but to me, Signalis is one of those legendary survival horror experiences that only comes every so often. Signalis hits the highs that I only really feel in other amazing story-driven survival horror games like Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, or Yume Nikki. It's a game that I'm sure people will be theory crafting for a while, but more importantly, I think it's an experience that in the future will look back to Signalis and put in the same pantheons as the masters of survival horror. Honestly, if there's one game to play in 2022, it's most definitely Signalis. Unless, of course, you get easily spooked by survival horror, but needless to say, I am so glad that I was able to experience this game and can't wait to see what else Rose Engine can cook up in the future. Well, fellas, we've made it right to the end of the video, and if you made it this far, thank you so much. You have no idea what it means to me to watch all the way to the end, because it means that, you know, maybe you found something good to listen to. If you really enjoyed this video, then go take a look back at my other games, maybe give it a like, and if you like my other reviews for other videos, then maybe you should go and maybe subscribe. That'd be cool. But that's basically the end of the video here. Signalis was an absolutely wonderful game to play through, and with that, we're kind of going into top 10 games of 2022 territory. I got maybe a couple more games that I got to play through, but after that, I'm going to be headfirst into writing the top 10 video. And so with that, this is the last video you're going to see in 2022. If you came here, thank you so much, fellas, for watching this. And this is Tom, the Chosen One, making a new time machine to go just 1 month into the future, and I'll see you guys next time.